If you don't sign the loan for me, then get out of this house." Those words echoed through the kitchen I once built with my own hands, steel frame by steel frame. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just sat there, slowly, wiping down an old horseshoe, the one that had stayed with me for over half my life. My son stood in front of me, his hands shaking with anger. My daughter-in-law turned away. Like I was a mistake she wished she could erase. 30 minutes later, when I stepped off the porch and onto the dirt path by the gate, the ground made a sound no one was expecting. Before I tell you what happened next in that house, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I read every single one. Now then, let's go back to that morning when I was still sitting in the kitchen and everything began to crack. I set the horseshoe down on the table slowly, the same way I had done it for years. In that kitchen, every steel beam, every weld felt more familiar to my hands than any face standing in front of me. And yet that day, I felt like a stranger. Brandon stood across from me, shoulders leaning slightly forward, the stance of someone pushed to the edge, still trying to look in control. On the table lay a thick folder, papers, crooked corners wrinkled like it had just been thrown down. I didn't need to open it to know what was inside. Debt, numbers, a signature, the very things I had avoided my whole life. 500,000, he said, his voice rough. All you have to do is sign. Your name still carries weight. I looked into my son's eyes. There was no trust left there, no respect, just a cold calculation. I reminded him this house didn't appear out of thin air, that I once stood in Pennsylvania, wind and snow, raising steel frames with these very hands, that the foundation beneath his feet had been checked by me, down to every millimeter. Brandon let out a dry laugh. "You already signed the transfer papers. It's mine now." He didn't say it loudly, but something inside me closed for good. In that moment I understood. To him my lifetime had been reduced to a signature at the bottom of a page, or money, or leaving. Jessica stood by the sink, a coffee mug in her hand, untouched. She didn't look at me. She spoke just loud enough for me to hear. "This house needs to be cleaner, and more suitable." There was no outright insult, but I heard every word. I stood up. My knees creaked softly. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. I walked to my room, the small one at the end of the hallway, still smelling of old wood and machine oil. I opened the wooden chest. It had followed me from the old forge to this house. Inside, there was no gold, no secret documents, just work clothes, a few faded photos, and an old satellite phone. I picked it up, weighing it in my hand. I hadn't used it in 40 years. When I returned to the living room, Brandon was standing there with his arms crossed. Jessica leaned against a chair, her eyes cold. I didn't explain. I said exactly 5 words, just as I had promised myself. "Come get me. Right now." Jessica let out a soft laugh. Brandon shook his head. "Who are you calling, Dad?" I didn't answer. I lifted the wooden chest and stepped onto the porch. The air outside was colder than I expected. Fog covered the path, like the land itself was trying to hide something. I set the chest down and sat on the step. The watch on my wrist kept ticking, steady as ever. I watched it, minute by minute. Voices drifted out from inside the house. They weren't whispering. They didn't need to. I heard talk of banks, deadlines, about how the old man was finally leaving. I wasn't angry. What I felt was a heavy emptiness, like steel that cools too fast, no longer bendable. 10 minutes passed. 20. Brandon opened the door, looked at me, then turned back inside. "How long are you planning to sit out there?" I didn't respond. I simply adjusted the chest so it sat straight. 30 minutes. I knew I wasn't wrong. The moment the second hand reached its mark, the air changed. First, a faint vibration under my feet, then a deep sound, low, steady, unhurried. The dirt road by the gate was used to pick up trucks and tractors. That day it welcomed something else. The fog tore apart in layers. Dark metal slid past the trees. The vehicle stopped slowly, as if it didn't want to disturb anyone. The door behind me flew open. I heard a sharp inhale. Brandon stepped out and froze. Jessica wasn't smiling anymore. No one spoke. I stood up. My back was straighter than before, not because of the vehicle, but because I knew. From that moment on, every ultimatum they had given me no longer mattered. I didn't turn back to look at them. I lifted the wooden chest and stepped off the porch. Inside me, there was no victory. Only one quiet thought. Some things take a lifetime to build, but it only takes one sentence to reveal who the people inside truly are. I walked slowly toward the gate, the wooden chest brushing against my leg each time I paused. Behind me I could feel their eyes, heavier than the fog, swallowing the path. No one called me back. Maybe they still thought that vehicle was a mistake, or some pointless display I had no business being connected to. The vehicle came to a full stop. The engine shut down, leaving a silence so deep I could hear dry leaves being crushed under the tires. The rear door opened first. No rush, no noise. 3 men in dark suits stepped out and lined up. They didn't look around. Their eyes locked onto me, as if I were the only fixed point left in that space. I heard Brandon swallow hard behind me. Jessica stood close to the porch, fingers gripping the edge of her coat. I didn't turn around. I had turned back enough times in my life. Then another man stepped out slower than the rest. He wasn't young, silver hair neatly combed, the steady posture of someone used to making decisions. When he saw me, he stopped and did something no one there expected. He bowed, not a polite nod. A deep bow, his whole body leaning forward. "Sir," he said, his voice low and clear, "I've been waiting for this call for 40 years. I set the wooden chest down. In that moment, every sound behind me seemed to vanish. I studied his face closely. Time had left its marks, but his eyes hadn't changed. They were the same eyes of the young man who once stood in my forge, shaking with fear, yet refusing to run. "William," I said, just his name. That was enough. He stepped closer, keeping a respectful distance. I came the moment the signal came through. "I hope I didn't make you wait." "I wasn't waiting," I said. "I was just sitting." One of the men in dark suits opened the door wider. William tilted his body, motioning for me to enter. I didn't rush. I turned around for the first time since the vehicle arrived. Brandon stood there, mouth slightly open, no sound coming out. Jessica had gone pale, her eyes darting, trying to piece together something that finally made sense. "I'll be gone a few days," I said evenly. "The house, do as you please." No one answered. I turned away and stepped into the vehicle. The door closed behind me, a soft but final sound sealing me off from that house. As the vehicle moved, I looked through the window. The wooden home faded into the fog. There was no sense of loss, just a page being turned. The drive was longer than I remembered. William didn't speak much. He sat across from me, hands resting on his keen eyes on the passing road. When we turned onto a private road leading to his estate, he finally spoke. "I never forgot that day," he said. "Without you, I wouldn't be here." I didn't answer right away. Some memories don't need words. I only asked, "You kept your promise?" William nodded. "Everything I have started that day." His estate was large but not flashy. I was shown into a quiet room, a window facing a line of low trees. When I sat down, William stood across from me, waiting for me to speak first. I looked at him and said the only reason I had come. "I want the truth," I said, "about my son." William didn't ask questions. He took out his phone and gestured to someone. "Check everything," he said calmly. "Finances, documents, connections." I leaned back in the chair. Fatigue crept into my body, but my mind felt unusually clear. As I waited, I thought of Brandon, of the look in his eyes when he threw that folder onto the table. That wasn't just ambition. That was fear, and someone had learned how to use it. Night slowly fell. The lights came on, warm and soft. William returned, placing a folder in front of me, thinner than I expected. He didn't open it. He looked at me as if weighing his words. "There are things," he said slowly, "you should know, but once you do, you won't see anything the same again." I nodded. "I didn't come here to keep things the same." William opened the folder. The figures stared back, neat and cold. I read every line. Each one peeled away another layer of paint. There was no loud collapse inside me, just a heavy realization, like discovering a piece of steel had been heated wrong for far too long. I closed the folder. Outside, night settled over the estate. I knew then this wasn't going to end with a vehicle appearing in the fog. Some truths had begun to surface, and once steel has been exposed to fire, no one can pretend it's still untouched. I didn't sleep right away that night, not because the room was unfamiliar, but because the numbers were still sitting in my head, refusing to settle. I was used to reading steel by the color of the fire. One glance and I knew exactly what state it was in. Paper is different. It stays quiet. And that silence, that's what leads people off course. The next morning I asked William to show me everything. Nothing left out. He didn't object. He knew I hadn't come here to be comforted. I needed the truth, even if it meant watching the house in my memory collapse one more time. The days that followed moved slowly. I sat in William's study, the window always cracked open just a little. His people brought in folders, statements, transfer records, one after another. I didn't rush. I read the way I used to inspect a weld. Look closely. Wait long enough. Ignore nothing. Brandon hadn't failed because of the market. That became clear early on. His early transactions were steady. Some even showed growth. Things only started to go wrong when the authorization documents appeared. Brandon's signature was there, consistent, but the ideas weren't his. Someone had laid the path out in advance. All he had to do was follow it. Jessica's name appeared more often than I expected, not in obvious places, in the small lines, the harmless-looking decisions. She stayed behind the scenes, quietly opening doors, making Brandon believe there was only one way forward. I didn't feel angry. I felt cold. William stayed silent while I read. Only when I looked up did he speak. There's one account you should see. That account wasn't in Jessica's name. It was located far away, a place where everything was wrapped in perfect legality. The money wasn't moved all at once. It was divided, regular, careful, like draining water from a ship without anyone noticing. 1,200,000. The amount sat there, clear and final, no guessing needed. I set the papers down. In that moment I understood why Jessica's eyes had looked so rushed that day. She didn't just want me gone. She needed me removed from every calculation. What kept me quiet longer was the name at the end of the transaction chain. A man in the legal profession, the same one handling Brandon's debt files. No explanation was necessary. The lines connected themselves. "Your son doesn't know," William said, as if reading my thoughts. "At least, not all of it." I nodded. Brandon wasn't clever. He grew up in this house, inside walls I built myself. He believed everything was solid, like steel. He didn't realize some things don't need force to break, just patience. There was one more detail, one that made me read the note several times. Internal comments mentioned a story I had never told Brandon, about the old forge, the land behind it, about how I once refused to sell even when the offer was high. Jessica had told Brandon I was hiding something there. Not bank money, but real value. A reserve only I knew about. She planted the idea slowly, enough for suspicion to grow, then disappointment, then anger. When I refused to share, I closed my eyes. I remembered Brandon as a boy sitting by the forge in the evenings asking endless questions. I hadn't hidden anything. I simply never taught him to chase what I never valued. William stood and walked to the window. "How do you want to handle this?" I didn't answer right away. I thought about that morning in the kitchen, the folder thrown onto the table, the ultimatum. Brandon hadn't spoken those words out of hatred. He said them because he believed I had betrayed him first. "I won't expose everything yet," I said. "Not now." William turned back surprised. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," I replied. "If you bend steel while it's cold, it snaps. I need it to pass through fire." He didn't ask more. He understood I wasn't looking for quick punishment. I wanted Brandon to see the whole picture, at the right moment, when no one was left to shield him or guide him. That afternoon I sat alone. No papers, no numbers. I asked myself something I never had before. What did I miss while raising my son? Was it my silence, my principles, that left room for someone else to step in? When the sun set, William returned with one last piece of information. Brandon was being forced to sell the house. There were no other options left. Debts were coming due. The people behind them were losing patience. I nodded. There was no confusion left in me now. Everything had taken shape. I knew the next step couldn't be avoided. And this time, I wouldn't be sitting on the porch waiting. I would step into the place where everything was being priced, to remind them that some things cannot be sold just because someone believes they own them. I arrived at the auction before the announced time, not to get a seat, but to see clearly the place where they were preparing to weigh that house like an object. The building wasn't large. White lights, The smell of paper mixed with metal. Everything was neatly arranged, as if a few strikes of a gavel could close an entire chapter of a life. Brandon was already there. I saw my son from a distance, sitting alone in the second row. His back was straight, but his shoulders were tight. He wasn't looking around. He wasn't waiting for anyone. In front of him lay the familiar folder, this time clipped neatly cleaner than before. I understood. In his mind there was only one way out: left cell. I didn't approach him. I took a seat in the last row far enough not to draw attention. William arrived a few minutes after me. He didn't sit with me. He took a seat across the room, quiet like a stranger. We didn't need to speak. Everything was already in place. When the auction began, the coordinator spoke in an even tone. Each detail was read off like a lifeless list. Square footage, location, starting price. Hands began to rise. The numbers climbed. Not fast, but steady. 2 million. 2 million 1. 2 million 2. I watched Brandon. Each increase tightened his jaw a little more. I thought back to that morning in the kitchen. He had said the house was his. On paper, maybe it was. But some things don't live on paper. I waited for the right moment. Not for drama, but because everything had to be in the proper place before being exposed. When the price reached the point Brandon had been hoping for, the coordinator raised the gavel for the first strike. I stood up. At first no one noticed. I walked slowly down the aisle between the rows. My footsteps sounded louder than I expected. A few people turned to look. Then Brandon turned around. His eyes landed on me. Empty for a brief second. I didn't hold his gaze. I placed a thin folder on the table in front of the coordinator. "Please stop," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to still the room. The coordinator hesitated. "Sir, the auction. You cannot sell what you do not own," I continued. I opened the folder. No long explanations. Just stamped documents. Words that had been there for 40 years. William stood up then. He stepped forward unhurried. "This land and structure," he said, "are registered as an industrial legacy site. The right to use and dispose of it cannot be transferred in the manner that was done." Murmurs spread through the room. The coordinator skimmed the pages, his face draining of color. Brandon jumped to his feet. "That's impossible," he said, his voice breaking. "I transferred it." "I know," I said, turning to him. "But you signed away something you never had the right to transfer." There was no anger in me at that moment, only fatigue. I looked at my son and saw the confusion clearly. No one was pulling him now. He was standing face to face with the truth. William added, calm and precise, "All transactions stemming from that transfer are invalid." The auction was stopped. No gavel came down. No winner was declared. Only eyes, turning toward me, measuring. I didn't care. I looked back at Brandon. "You don't owe the bank anymore," I said. "You don't owe the people who pressured you." His breathing quickened. "Then who do I owe?" "Me," I answered. "And that's a debt you can't repay with a signature." I saw his shoulders slump. Not from fear, but from realizing there was no way left to run. I didn't offer him a choice right then. I let silence do its work. Some lessons don't need explanations. After everyone left, the room slowly emptied. Brandon was still standing there. He didn't look at me. "Why did you do this?" he asked quietly. "I did it to close one circle," I said, "and to open another." I turned away. William walked out with me. The sky outside was low and gray. There was no sense of victory, only a decision finally placed where it belonged. I knew the hardest part was still ahead. Exposing the truth was only the beginning. What I was about to do would slow everything down, make it heavier, uncomfortable for everyone involved. But it was the only way for steel to hold its shape, after it has passed through fire. I left the auction building as the afternoon was fading. No one stopped me. There was nothing left to argue. Brandon followed a few steps behind. He didn't ask anything. Maybe for the first time in many years, he didn't know what to ask. We didn't speak on the drive back. The car moved steadily, unhurried. I looked out the window as the trees slipped past. Sometimes silence is the only way to let things settle, before words do more damage than good. My old forge was still there behind the wooden house. The tin roof was worn. The wooden door, darkened by time. I parked and stepped out. The familiar smell hit me at once. Metal, wood. The smell of the years when my body was stronger. Brandon stood behind me, looking around. as if he were truly seeing this place for the first time. I opened the forge door. Afternoon light poured in, catching the tools neatly hung on the walls. I took an old set of protective gear and placed it in his hands. No accusations, no conditions. For 5 years I said, "You'll work here." Brandon looked up. "I don't know how to forge." "No one does at the beginning," I replied. "You'll learn," I continued slowly. "Minimum wage. Each day of work counts toward your debt. No shortcuts, no signatures." He looked at the gear in his hands, then at me. I saw resistance flicker, then fade. He nodded, just once. Very small. Jessica wasn't there. I didn't call her. The truth didn't need my help finding its way. A few days later, William told me what needed to be said. Documents matched. Money trails exposed. There was nowhere left for her to hide. It all moved forward the way it should have, quietly. Without my presence, I didn't feel relieved. I felt it was necessary. Some doors have to be closed so people stop walking through them. The weeks that followed passed slowly. Brandon came to the forge every morning. At first his hands were clumsy, his focus scattered. I didn't shout. I showed him how to stand, how to breathe, how to wait for the metal to change color before touching it. Some days he grew tired and sat on the steps silent for a long time. I let him sit. Steel needs time to cool too. William stopped by, now and then. He didn't come into the forge. He sat on the porch, drank tea, looked out at the yard. We didn't revisit the past. We talked about the weather, about things that change slower than people think. One afternoon, when the sun was low, Brandon set the hammer down and sighed. "I think I understand now," he said. "Not about steel." I didn't ask. I knew what he meant. Some lessons don't need names. That evening I sat on the old porch. The wood creaked softly under the chair. William sat beside me, quiet as always. From behind us, I heard the steady sound of the hammer in the forge. Not hard, not rushed, just the rhythm of work. The luxury vehicle was still parked in the yard, under the yellow light. It no longer drew attention. I looked at it for a moment, then stood up. I didn't walk toward it. I opened the door to the wooden house, stepped inside, and closed it behind me. Inside, everything was simple. Nothing new, but the feeling was familiar, like finishing a weld the right way. Not perfect, just solid. Before going to my room, I looked back at the forge one last time. Brandon was working, sweat darkening his shirt. I didn't call out to him. I left him there, with his work. I thought about the words spoken that day in the kitchen. The ultimatum. The vehicle arriving after 30 minutes. What looked like power turned out to be a test. Steel must pass through fire to hold its shape. People are no different. A home isn't walls or paperwork. A home is where someone still knows how to bow to what's right and stand back up to make things right. I turned off the light. Outside, the hammer kept its steady rhythm. And for the first time in a very long while, I knew I had chosen the right place to stop. If this story made you pause even for a moment, please tap, like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with anyone who might need to hear something like this. Every bit of your support helps these slow, honest human stories continue. Thank you for staying until the very end. I wish you a peaceful evening,